Okay, can everybody online hear well? If somebody could give a thumbs up, that would be awesome. Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for coming out to the first cause seminar for the year. We fully intended for this to be the second cause seminar, but conflicts happened, and apparently we are busy people at Purdue. So, um, with no further ado, let me introduce myself. I'm Candace Croney. I have the privilege of serving as the director for the Center for Animal Welfare Science, which is what we abbreviate to as CAUSE. I've been in that role for 10 years now. It goes fast. It's great to see some familiar faces and also some brand new faces. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out. CAUSE, for those of you who don't know, is jointly supported by the College of Agriculture and the College of Veterinary Medicine. So all of our programming is intended to facilitate the work of anybody who is interested in animal welfare science. It does not matter where you are located on campus. We do have the model that it is a faculty-led center. That's a pretty typical model on campus. Nonetheless, we know there are a number of people, including staff and students, and sometimes visiting scholars who would like to engage with CAUSE and like to be affiliated in some way with CAUSE. So we are doing a relaunch and a reboot of the center, and we are going to try to find ways to accommodate those interests and get people as involved and engaged as they would like to be. So we will look forward to any ideas you have for that kind of activity. And with no further ado, I am going to give you over to the amazing Dr. Darrin Karcher. He is the Poultry Extension Specialist for Animal Sciences and for all of us here at Purdue University. He is going to talk to you about the work that he has done with laying hen welfare, the implications of different housing systems for laying hens, what that means for food safety, and potentially also for consumers. So, Dr. Karcher.
Thank you, Candace.
Okay.
Okay, so as long as everybody can hear me okay online, if not, just speak up in the chat. Otherwise, today I would like to share a little bit about this interesting intersection amongst a lot of different topics. And realistically, what this means is that at the time I was asked for a title, I wanted to talk about chickens. I didn't know what I wanted to actually talk about, so I just threw a whole bunch of stuff in the title. So now I have to try to touch on things within my title. So we'll see how we do. All right. If you all think about the last time that you went to the grocery store and went to buy some eggs, unlike this where they're laid out across the lab floor so I can get a nice picture, you're faced with this decision. What kind of eggs do I want to purchase today? Do we want something that is going to be fairly cheap as a commodity egg, because that's how we're still producing 60% of our eggs here in the US? Do I want something that's branded and well known as a consumer? So Eggland's Best, having that ability to carry extra vitamins for me, omega-3s, what have you, whatever's on the label. Maybe I'm someone who believes a little more in innovation, Kipster, cage-free. That's about 40% roughly of our eggs produced in the US. And so maybe that's where I would prefer to put my dollar. Or maybe I really want to start looking at free range, pasture, or organic. So you now, as a consumer, have to decide, where do I want to put my dollar? I can tell you that when I walk in, I put my dollar right here, right? Why do I put my dollar there? I have 5 kids. I'm trying to find a very cheap animal protein source that I know can feed a fair amount of people. And I also know enough about the background and the science that there's not necessarily the trade-offs that people believe from a nutritional standpoint with eggs on the right side to the left side. So part of our problem is that when we face all of this as a consumer, I think there's a lot of things that we may not know, right? We tend to think we understand our consumers. The producers are more than willing that if you decide this is the type of egg I want, so if you all decided that you want eggs that are laid by blue hens on the third Thursday of every second month, and you're willing to pay $20 per dozen, the commercial egg producers will figure out a way to get you exactly what you are willing to pay for. So the industry will respond. But what do we really know about the preferences of our consumers? So in this paper that was published this year, they looked at 521 different consumers. And so what they did is go through and they gave them some choice experiments where they could look at different production systems. They could have 3 different instances of animal welfare and 3 different prices. And then various combinations of those choices came up, and the consumers then had to make a decision, or they could just decide, I'm not interested in any of that. And then the authors took all that data and analyzed those results. So when we look at the demographics of those 531 people, the majority fell within my age range, that 35 to 54. 55% were females, 74% were white, 68% had a partner, and the majority of the income was 50 to 99,999. So that is where the majority fell within their distribution, but they did have that full breadth of individuals respond. Now, what was interesting is when they started to tease this out, if it had organic on the label, there was a higher likelihood that they would purchase it. If it was price, that was negative, right? So as price increased, they were less likely to purchase that. I don't think that surprises any of us. But when it came down to animal welfare, when it looked at the cage-free, the pasture, and the free range, there was no significance at all. It did not seem to appeal one way or the other from their willingness to pay for that label. So they decided that they would dig into that a little bit more to try to better understand this interesting thing that they were finding. So that middle age group, which was the majority of those respondents, had no preference for that free range or pasture, but they did prefer cage free. At the same time, if they were older than 55, they actually wanted birds that were outdoor access, free range, or that pasture. But if the price was too high, then they became price sensitive and they weren't interested in paying for it. In both instances, neither group was concerned about organic. And the other conclusion that they drew from their data was that the educated individuals preferred the free range pasture raised compared to the cage free, but of course were price sensitive. So maybe some of this surprises us, maybe some of it doesn't. But the bigger thing when you look at that data set is there seems to be a very strong differentiation for a lot of people between what does organic mean and what that may imply for me as a consumer versus the welfare of cage-free, free-range, and pasture. And again, there was no education. It was strictly going off of this is what it says on the carton. So this paper that was published in 20 did a lit review, and it's a really interesting paper as they dig into, I think there were 35 different publications that they looked at where they were trying to better understand why people have a preference as a consumer towards one type of egg or the other. And really, this is what it all comes down to. And it was 34, sorry, not 35, 34 articles. But what they found across those 34 articles is that there has been a lot of work in some areas. So when you look at things related to questioning sustainability or price and giving consumers those options or those types of things to consider when they purchase their products, there was a lot of research to support that they're interested in that. Maybe in some instances, they actually did some homework and understood what that means. In other instances, not so much. At the same time, though, some of the intrinsic things related to the eggs, there actually wasn't much research at all. So there's still a lot of things that we don't understand what draws a consumer to a certain type of egg that is being produced. There's a lot of times that if you ask someone, well, why did you buy this type of an egg? They'll tell you it tastes better, it looks better. We also know that it has to align with values. So for some of you, if we go back to that first picture, you probably already know which type of eggs you will always buy. And that also stems from your values, even though that's a little more tricky for us to talk with consumers and talk to each other about what are your values and how does that align how you may purchase things within the store. So what does this mean? Well, imagine that if we have misinformation, we don't clearly define things, that there's a lot of misunderstanding on our labels and our consumers are just confused. I don't think that that's really new to any of us, but to some people that probably isn't something they've really ever thought about. Do you really understand what it means to be pasture by American Humane Certified or pasture by GAP certification or any of the other certifying bodies that are out there? So let's talk housing systems. Okay, maybe not these housing systems, but something like it, right? We know that this all started back in the 1920s and well before that. This is how we produced our eggs. This is how we produced our animal protein. You had this hen right here who went out of production and we needed to have a chicken for Sunday dinner, and so she became Sunday dinner. You had a rooster or a cockerel who looked at you crossways and decided that he wanted to be in charge and you didn't like that, so he became Sunday dinner. That's just how things evolved together. And we also had some seasonal production. As we come into winter like we are right now, our eggs were probably not being produced as much as they had been, and that's okay. So we just have our chickens then to supply our meat source throughout the winter. We'll repopulate with some chicks in the spring and we'll start again. The 1950s, this is when we saw our change. Coming out of World War II, we figured that we needed to become an efficient machine at producing food for a lot of people. And so we, through science, figured out if we take the birds out of the litter and we put them in cages where we can separate their feces from them, they actually are more healthy. We have more control with how we feed and water them, and they actually produce more eggs. So we took them off the ground, we put them in cages, and that started our step into the conventional cage era, which has lasted well over 70 years. In 2000s, the reason that this sticks in my head is this is when I was starting my master's degree, and there was an article that I read in like Better Homes and Garden or something like that about how people in Hollywood were buying these immaculate chicken coops for the low, low price of $10,000 so they could produce their 6 eggs. And they felt wonderful that they were producing their own eggs. So at that point, I argue that's when we really started to see mainstream produce your own eggs coming online. Because let's be honest, if it's happening in Hollywood, everybody's seeing it. Well, I can be like them. And so it may have been happening, but that's when it really started to become mainstream. At the same time, we're just over here doing our thing, making sure those eggs are available in the grocery store for the average consumer. Of course, we had our specialty eggs, but that wasn't really a big thing at that point in time. Then in 2017, we started to see this real big shift into cage-free. And that is all because in September of 2015, McDonald's made an announcement. We are going to be 100% cage-free by 2025 for all eggs that we use. And then all of a sudden, we saw in those last few months of 15, early into 16, this massive rush by a lot of different food service restaurants all saying we're going to produce cage-free eggs. We're going to be cage-free. We're going to be cage-free. The only holdout, and it was till about mid-16, was Walmart. And as soon as Walmart said it, that was the proverbial slamming of the door. We are now going to be cage-free in the US. Up to that point, there was talk of this thing called the enriched colony cage, which was kind of a middle ground between the two that had some validity, maybe some traction. In Canada, that is where they have decided to go. And that is where there's a lot of push as they go from the conventional cage to an intermediate step. We decided to just go all the way to cage-free. So these are the types of housing systems that we were seeing in 2017. You would have some that maybe were a little bit designed for it. We had a lot of this where, okay, I'm going to take my pre-existing house, I'm going to rip all the doors off of it, I'm going to throw in some things. Now think about this. It's all you could do to squeeze. So usually you'd walk like this and then you'd shuffle. Then you'd walk and you'd shuffle all the way down a 600-foot house, right? Takes a little bit of time to get there. And then we had just what is considered barn in other countries. We call it a floor system, but it's just pretty much like being in this room, and the birds can jump up on the table and jump down and go about their business. That's pretty much our housing that we had in 17. Now, 2024, we're starting to see more push, more emphasis in free range pasture outdoor access. So this was a farm that I visited here in the last few years, and they have their stationary barn here. You can see that it's fenced off. We have some pasture over here. We have what the chickens have decided isn't really something that they wanted, so they denuded all of the soil of any pasture or any living vegetation. And so that's free range or pasture. But the question becomes, and there was a really good talk last week, I believe it was, through the PEC committee. So it's a collaborative group of welfare-minded individuals in poultry that had a seminar, and they had an individual who was talking with the American Pastured Poultry Association. And they were talking about how they perceive and how they view pasture. And it's more like this, where it's mobile coops. So now we start to see some differentiation between free range and pasture. What does that mean? And at the same time, is this better or is this better? I don't know. So we have lots of things that as we move into extensive housing systems, especially into this outdoor access that we don't know. We really have no idea what would be the ideal composition of a pasture for poultry, right? In other countries, there are certain plants that are natural dewormers for some livestock species. Maybe that's something we could be investigating. We don't know really if legumes would be better or grasses would be better, right? We look a little bit to maybe what's being done with our ruminants, but to be honest, we really haven't spent that effort in poultry to understand that. We don't know the actual space. In some instances, you could have 100 plus square feet per bird outside. You could have 2 square feet per bird outside, right? Every certifying body has kind of drawn a line about where they believe it should be. We also don't take into account location within the world. Sounds great to have chickens on pasture till tomorrow when it's a high of 32, right? And just so you all know, we do have 150 birds on pasture in that coop that I showed you. So we're going to find out tomorrow when it drops to 32 how they like that 32-degree weather, right? So that's something we have to factor in. Where in the world are you, and is it even feasible to provide year-round outdoor access? The environmental impact, right? We're very concerned about how we may be impacting the environment. And when you dig through the literature trying to understand the implications of pasture and outdoor access, there's just not a lot of literature there to give us direction on what it may mean for us long-term. Nutritional implications, as I told you, 70 plus years in the conventional cage, we know how to feed laying hens in a cage. But as we move into extensive housing systems, cage-free outdoor access, there's a lot more things that they can consume that we haven't thought about, or that we don't know how to necessarily factor it into the way that we feed our birds. And there's so many more things. You pretty much throw a dart right now at the proverbial dartboard, and you can hit a question we probably don't have the answer to as we talk about birds moving into outdoor access. However, I did find a paper published this year, which started to look at this idea of what does it mean to have a pasture composition one way or the other. And so they took 12-week-old birds, 124 brown birds, roughly a year on study, and they put them into 3 systems. So deep litter system means that it would be like this room. Okay, so we would just have the shavings or litter substrate on the floor. So that was this one. They had no outdoor access. They had another one that had outdoor access, but everything in the pasture was a legume. And then we had another one where everything was grass. And when we look, they did 4 replicates, 20 birds each, 4 meters squared per bird access is what they provided to those birds. Now, when they talk about the behavior and welfare measures, at 52 weeks, they observed them for 7 days. The way that they did this is they had individuals go out after 5 minutes of standing at the pen so the birds could be familiar with the fact that there was something new. They then observed 2 focal birds for 25 minutes then to see what they did in that 25 minutes of time. And they marked them with livestock paint a week in advance, at least, it said, so that those birds could be easily identifiable. Now, what I questioned about it was, how did you know which random birds that you were marking a week in advance? But, they didn't explain that, so we can all wonder that question together. They also talked about tonic immobility, and they said in this case, they just gave time points. They didn't even give us the weeks of age. And so they said early, peak, and late. And so that's open to interpretation. So I'm not saying that this is the greatest paper ever published, but it is something to give us some direction to move one way or the other. So the most important thing, and this is how they defined other, so it's there for your viewing pleasure. If you look at the graph, it didn't matter if it was a legume, it didn't matter if it was a grass. What they reported is that if the birds had outdoor access, they didn't do as much standing. I don't know that that would surprise any of us necessarily. They were out locomoting, they were out doing other things in the pasture area as opposed to being within the confined area at which they had. And conversely, then when you look at the sitting, the walking, nesting, all of them, the only change here was the eating behavior. They said that the deep litter birds were eating more than the other 2 that had access to the pasture. Now, I would argue that this could easily be explained if they're out in the pasture for how they defined eating with their ethogram, that they were out there and they were, in fact, eating things, just not with the way that they defined it for how they were evaluating if the birds were considered eating. Now, when we look at the behaviors, there was nothing for the tonic immobility. No, that's coming up. Sorry, this one, don't believe the slide. It's not behaviors. It's actually, they looked at microbiota. And the only thing that I thought was interesting in this, which supports what I would anticipate, is that they had a lot more microbiota on the egg surface. But unfortunately, I don't know how many eggs they sampled. I don't even know how they sampled the microbiota because that was not very clear in the methodology. But that makes sense to me because they didn't even tell us where the eggs were found. So if they were picking up eggs in the litter versus in the pasture or in the nesting area, we would expect to see very different microbiotas being reported. The one that I did find most interesting, though, was here in the crop. Now, if you're not familiar with birds, the crop sits right here at the bottom of the throat before it would go into their first stomach. Chickens have two stomachs, in case you didn't know that. There's something new for you to also learn about. But they have this thing called a crop. And the idea is that as they have evolved, they went from where they lived in the trees, they would jump down, eat as much as they can. That crop would be a reservoir for which they could hold all that food, go back into the trees for safety or wherever they needed to be. They could then slowly pass that food through the digestive system. So it does not surprise me that we see a change in the microbiota between birds that are only indoors, and the only thing that they can be pecking at in addition to the feed would be the litter in which they are in, versus those birds that are also outside that have a lot more exposure to a lot of different things. And all of those things would influence that pH within that crop, which could change the microbiota profile. So that's the one thing that I found really interesting. Again, with some of the lackluster of details, I don't know how much faith I put in it, but it would be some things that I think could be very interesting to look down the road of how that changes things like that within the microbiota of the birds, which ultimately would then translate to food safety. So TI, for tonic immobility, they were shorter in the outdoor access, and they said there was no difference between the two types of access, legumes or grass. And based on the references they provided, digging into those papers, yes, in fact, that seems to be the consensus, that if you have environments where they have more things going on, they tend to have a shorter tonic immobility time compared to those birds that have a more simple environment. They took rectal temperatures, respiratory rate to try to go after changes in stress, and they observed absolutely nothing. And then the overall conclusion was that less fear for outdoor access, minimal stress, more active, and maybe there's some potential for bacterial modulation. So from my standpoint, what I took away from this is it goes back to the point, we really don't know, but I think they have some interesting data that could build some fantastic research questions to now start to position ourselves to better understand the influence that a pasture may have on the whole system of that bird, and not just think about the behavior or the welfare. So there's lots of ingenuity in the outdoor space, but is it the future? That's the question, right? For as many different iterations that you can conceive right now, if I asked you all to come up with one, you could all give me this really interesting way we could put birds out there on outdoor access. We probably could find it somewhere if we use Dr. Google. He's got a great repository of images, but the reality is we have this small thing called minimal land within the world. And there's just no way that we can get to a point where we could look at this as our only way of producing our eggs moving forward in the future. But I firmly believe it will continue to have a spot within the types of eggs that we produce and make available to consumers around the world. So this is my perspective of how I think this all fits together. So if we start at the bottom, we have the physiology of the bird. So everything that we do and start to play with is somehow going to impact the physiology of that bird. So what do? We try to formulate and work with all the nutrition to make sure that we're feeding into everything for the physiology so the bird grows normal, does whatever it needs to do to survive. At the same time, we encounter insults. And so we have health challenges that come up. So what do? We play with the nutrition, we introduce vaccines, ultimately trying to get us back to the physiology of the bird to get us into that homeostasis so the bird can still grow. We then have this overarching thing called food safety. We can pride ourselves in the US that we have the safest food supply. So what do? We vaccinate, and we do a whole bunch of things to modify the health and all the way down to physiology. Do you see where I'm going here? Everything we do ultimately is going to end up affecting the physiology of this bird. All of our management decisions, that influences how we approach food safety, how we produce those birds in order to make sure that we have eggs that are safe. And ultimately, then, we have this bigger thing called well-being. And so when we're trying to think about the big scope of everything, so not just the welfare, but also the behaviors, also the states of being for those birds, all of that is encompassed. And every decision that we make all the way down here is going to influence everything. And so that's how I view this. And this is how I approach most everything that I try to do when I'm asking a research question or trying to come up with something inventive to ask. I thought this was a great quote. Hens can make the choices according to their needs and desires, right? That's what we're striving to do as we move from the conventional cage to a new type of housing system, be it cage-free, outdoor access. That's what we're trying to do, is to give those birds the ability to be free agents, do whatever the heck you like, as long as you can produce me an egg, please. That's all we would like. So this paper did a review of some of the challenges, and they also gave solutions. But why would we talk about solutions? Because if we don't know what the challenges are, how do we get to come up with the creative solutions, right? So these are the challenges that they view as being most important, or some of our drivers as we move to extensive housing systems. We know that we are inundated with parasites now. Well, not us personally, but our chickens, okay? We have diseases that are appearing in cage-free birds and outdoor and access birds that we have not seen in years. In fact, you have veterinarians retiring at the end of their career that saw these diseases when they were young. They all disappeared, and now they're coming back. And you've got other veterinarians entering that, wow, we've only ever seen this in textbooks, right? So we have a lot of fun things popping up in the world of parasites. Same with bacterial and viral diseases. And so now it's trying to come up with innovative ways to think about how do we deal with these challenges that are occurring so that we can make sure we're doing what's best for the birds, at the same time trying to make sure we can maintain that egg supply that we're trying to have in place for the consumer. We know that the environment is changing, right? I don't know that any of us could have predicted the warm weather or the very mild weather, whatever you want to call it, that we've had all the way up until tomorrow. But all of a sudden, we're going to snap and tomorrow's going to be cold. So we know that there are temperature stresses, thermal stresses that birds are experiencing around the world. So how do we mitigate those? How do we deal and factor that into the way that we are producing our eggs and dealing with our birds? If we move to the outdoor area, we have predation. Right. So I do know that so far, cross my fingers, the coyotes love the sheep at the livestock farms and haven't bothered the chickens. So that's either really good or really bad. We also have eagles that have not found my chickens yet either. So, the two fantastic predators that we haven't dealt with, but it's the reality of knowing that that predation pressure is there. And when it happens, what is the recourse that you have as the producer or the caretaker of those birds to prevent that predation from occurring again? Outdoor area use. So I talked about the fact that it's all over the board on how much space we give them, but there's been a lot of conversations recently that it's not about how much space, but it's the quality of the space provided. I don't know that we really know what that means. We have some good ideas based on some past research. The other thing is that when you look at a lot of our research that's been done in the past, a lot of it's been done with broilers, and meat birds are very different from laying hens. And so some things may translate, others may give us a great direction, but they probably are not really applicable. The range, vegetation enrichment, talked about that. Flock size, that's a fun question, right? Is it better to be in a big house with 80,000 of your friends, or would you prefer to be in a big house where you've got subsections of 5,000 of your friends, right? We don't understand the bigger social dynamics that exist as we move to extensive housing systems. And so those are all things that if we better understand, maybe we can design things or think about things a little bit differently. That plays into our stocking density. Feather pecking is another big area of concern. It's one thing when we have a feather pecking incidence that goes bad and we end up with cannibalism in a small group of conventional birds that maybe we had 20 birds in that cage, but now it's done. But when I have a flock of 20,000 birds and we have a cannibalistic event start, how do you get ahead of it? How do you keep it from stopping so that you're not losing hundreds of birds because of this behavior that's now running rampant through the house? We have this thing that used to be exotic, highly pathogenic avian influenza, and I'm so sick and tired of seeing it in the news. I hope everybody else is too. It's endemic, right? It is now just something we have to deal with. So how do we have to think differently on how we approach things like this that used to just be once every 25, 30 years it would occur, to it occurs now pretty regular or even on a yearly basis. And then we have skeletal health. We have issues when we get to the point where we give birds more mobility. It's great, right? They build skeletal structure because they're jumping, they're doing lots of things that help to strengthen that bone. Conversely, they also put themselves in situations where they can fracture their bones, break their bones, other things. And so it's a trade-off. How do you start to mitigate some of those things that are occurring so that you can get a better holistic view of what's going on within that scope of the environment the birds are in? So this was 2022. What I think is interesting, though, is we really ought to get an idea of how do the veterinarians here in the U.S. view our problems. So this is the Association of Veterinarians in Egg Production. So these are the vets that are responsible. I think they cover 90% of all the laying hens in the U.S., and they're sent a survey every year, and they're asked to rank various things and add in things. And so these are the top 3 things of concern, according to the survey they conducted this year. The birds on the left are caged. So those would be our conventional cage. Coryza, coccidiosis, and infectious bursal disease. So those are going to be more bacterial diseases that we're dealing with. Coccidiosis is a gut disease. And so that was big for cage pullets. E. coli, coryza was big for cage layers, and then cannibalism was popping up as a concern that veterinarians are dealing with. As we move into extensive housing, cage-free, we get piling, we get the coccidiosis again, and part of coccidiosis, you can also end up with necrotic enteritis, again, a gut insult, and so another health disease related to the intestine. Cage-free layers, we get the E. coli, the piling, and the peckouts. And then pretty much the only thing that's new when we get to cage-free layers with outdoor access is roundworms. So this is what they view as their 24 survey biggest areas of concern as veterinarians, or things that they're constantly dealing with that they would like to have better solutions. Now, I pulled out of that same report. This is their year-to-year survey. And so you can see from 21 to 24. And depending on the year, so in 22, it was a lack of approved and effective treatments was extremely high, as well as highly pathogenic avian influenza. But you can see now that those have downshifted into 24. But we see that lack of effective vaccines is popping up as a major concern from the veterinarians that are working with laying hens. I think stuff like this is really interesting, right? Because it is real world. It is what they are seeing day in and day out. So it's not sitting here wondering if this is a problem. This is the problem that they're trying to resolve. They ask for layer welfare concerns. And this is how they ranked their various concerns. The biggest one is still emergency depopulation methodology. I mean, how can it not be when all of a sudden you are faced with taking down 2.5 million laying hens? How do you do that? Right? And so there's ways out there, and we do the best we can with what we have, but this is still a major concern. These MAC carts, you can see that that's starting to come down. So that means that there's either better education going on or a better design. The MAC carts are carts that they charge with CO2 and then put the birds into as they're pulling them for depopulation. But you can see that that's still a concern. Beak treatments, male chick euthanasia. So cage-free management issues is the other one of major concern. As we continue to see more and more movement towards cage-free production, we still have a lot of things to learn. And what's unfortunate is I can learn it all today with this flock of birds, and by next year, when I have the same genetics, same everything, at least I believe it is, they act completely different. So everything I just learned may or may not apply. So it really is a much different learning curve when we move into cage-free environments. So I was asked for a 3-minute webinar, right? We give lots of different types of talks. I was charged with 3-minute webinar. And so this was the question: and how would you describe the recent progress in welfare on egg farms? We have welfare certifications for our housing systems. We're now really moving towards having pullet rearing that is appropriate for the laying hen, and then movement towards animal-based measures, right? That's where I think there's a lot of progress that has occurred and is still occurring. So let's talk a little bit about welfare certifications. So we've really got 3, I'll call them buckets, that we can find certifications. One is our NGOs. And so those non-government organizations that are going to say, here's our scientific committee that we've convened, and here's their recommendations. Here's what we've decided is the best, and here's what we're actually going to do. Please note, this is what was suggested. This is what we think is best, and here's what we're going to do. Okay, please notice the results. Producer organizations, okay, same sort of thing. There's a little more haggling from what I understand. Here's what we think you should do. Well, we can't quite do that, but we could do this. It's not quite where we want to be, but okay, we can meet you halfway. We understand the reality of the situation. But again, these also are different ways that you could be certified. And then finally, we even have food service and grocery that have decided we know how to do something better than everybody else, and so we're going to ask you to follow our way of doing it. Now, as a producer, and this is great conversation, when you go to a complex that may have, let's say, 10 barns, and they're like, yes, house 1, 2, and 3 is this certification, 4, 5, and 6 is this one, 7 is this one, 8 is this one, 9 is this one, right? They really do that because they understand that each one of these may warrant a different market value. And if I need you as a customer, and you being a customer is Walmart, McDonald's, bigger scope, right? Not me as the end consumer buying that carton of eggs. They're going to try to hit as many as they can because they're trying to have a diversity in who they're selling their eggs to. So it makes it, or could make it, very interesting. So let's just look at an example here. We'll take these 4 organizations and who certifies what. So the only group that certifies conventional cage is the United Egg Producers. And so that way, then there's at least on the commodity egg, if they are a UEP member, you will see that it is UEP certified. And so they have some regulations on what it takes to produce eggs in a conventional system. Now, if we move into cage free, we have UEP, we have American Humane, and then we have Certified Humane. So those 3 organizations have cage-free qualifications for what it means from a welfare perspective to carry their seal of humane production, however you want to term it. When we get to free range, we have American Humane and Certified Humane. And then when we get to pasture, we have American Humane, Certified Humane, and then AGA, which is the American Grassland Association. And they worked closely with the American Poultry Producers Association to develop a standard of which you have to be a member of APPA to actually get the AGA certification. Not complicated at all. You just have to understand the system, right? So this is for housing systems. Now, when we talk about welfare, let's just take two, and this is not everything. I just wanted to highlight how this can be confusing. So if we're talking about pasture, you can at least see that for both American Humane and Certified Humane, they're saying the same amount of space per bird for outdoor access, 108.9. To give you perspective, that means for a 20,000 bird house, you have 50 acres of which the chickens can go out and use. For free range access, American Humane says 21.8 square feet per bird outdoor access, but Certified Humane says only 2. Minimum time for American Humane is 8 hours outside, where Certified says at least 6. Now, if it's 90 days with inclement weather, you have up to 90 days throughout a year in which you can keep them in the house because of bad weather, whatever the issue is, and still carry their seal of approval. For Certified Humane, it's 14 consecutive days. But what's unclear with this program is, could you do 14 consecutive days, take a month off, come back for another 14 days? The way I read it, you absolutely could. But that would be something you would talk to them as a certifying body to say, here's the circumstance, here's what's going on. Now, if there's a disease, at least for American Humane, they said if you have a vet note, so give me your doctor's note and you can keep your birds in the house. Certified Humane doesn't have that statement, or at least the last iteration I saw doesn't have anything like that. With the way that high path is endemic, I'm sure that they probably have had those conversations, and that is probably a consideration as well. So just to kind of give you how something is American Humane certified for free range is very different from what it means to be certified humane free range, right? But unless you dig into it, you probably don't understand UC free range. So now, this really surprised any of you that consumers get confused? I mean, look at what they're claiming here for their eggs. So they're humanely raised in roam-free enriched colony condo hotel housing with perch bars and nesting pads to practice their natural behaviors, providing protection from predators and diseases because they're in a cage, right? But you picked up on free roaming hotel housing, and I don't know if you thought, oh, it's a cage, right? So some of it is, how do you sell yourself to the consumer? 24-hour access to homegrown feed, water, light, and ventilation. Well, that's good because otherwise you may have some other problems. Yeah, they grow in light, just like plants. And then clean, litter-free environment and no use of antibiotics. This right here kills me. There's no antibiotic use at all in eggs because if there was, it goes into the egg and they can't sell it because it's an adulterated product. But most people don't understand that, right? So why does it then surprise us that our consumers are confused when they go to the grocery store to buy their dozen of eggs and what that may mean? So what would you choose? If we eliminated all of these different types of eggs and we gave you eggs here that are refrigerated, or we gave you eggs here that can be delivered fresh to your home, which one would you choose? Right? You have to understand that when you look across the world, there's only 3 countries that actually wash and refrigerate eggs, and we are one of them. This is every other country in the world, right? So those are the steps that we take to make sure that we have an extremely safe food supply. So what makes things a little more complicated in the egg world is we have this thing called the FDA egg safety rule. And it's a preventative program, and it can include vaccinations or non-antibiotic intestinal health aids. All right, so probiotics, things like that. And if they are less than 3,000 birds, they're exempt from having to abide by this federal rule. But almost every producer that is following this is complying with it. They're doing 2 vaccines, so it'll be 2 live and then some sort of a bacterin vaccine throughout the pullet phase. And then they also are doing probiotics, something in the feed. So they're doing everything they can to try to make sure that Salmonella enteritidis does not enter the food supply chain. But here's the challenge. Right now, FDA has to enforce their rule for outdoor access. And the rule was created over 15 years ago. At that point in time, it was going after one really bad apple in the egg industry who was producing in conventional cages. It's only focused on Salmonella enteritidis, so we're not talking about any other foodborne pathogen that you may be able to get. We're only concerned with this one specific organism. I already told you that 20,000 birds is 50 acres. And part of the things that you have to do as a producer is you have to keep monitor or records of your rodents. How do you monitor rodents in 50 acres? Right? It says you cannot commingle species. And so my question for FDA is if you're trying to keep wild birds out of your house and you have chickens that go out in the pasture and the wild birds come in, that's commingling of species. Well, that's not allowed. Well, what do you want me to do? Well, you can't do anything. Well, then it's kind of a pointless thing to enforce, right? So there's some challenges that FDA has to figure out, and at the same time, the producer has to figure out, because if they can't abide by it, they can't be in business. We also have double standards. So the poultry house has to be rodent proof, but yet pop holes are giant holes. And so the way they do is they walk and they say, yep, this looks great. And they see the wide open, oh, that's a pop hole. It's outdoor access. It's okay. But that is very frustrating, right? For a producer. Now, this is the big question. So what if we start talking about quality of pasture and we say you need to consider adding this, this, and this in your pasture so that the birds will use it, and it directly goes against what FDA says is allowed? Who trumps? Is it the welfare or is it FDA? And my argument with some of the NGOs I talk to is you will lose every time, because FDA puts me out of business. You're just an animal welfare certification. And it's not intended to be demeaning or belittling, but it's the reality of where the two play with each other. So I tell you, we do everything we can to have a safe food supply. How many of you knew that we had an egg recall this past fall? Yeah, a few people, right? So Milo's Poultry Farm out of Wisconsin, they had 65 cases across 9 states. 24 people became hospitalized. The egg safety rule applied to some of the farms. What's not here is the fact that there were 30 total farms. 10 of them were greater than 3,000 birds. So you had 20 farms that were under 3,000 birds, so FDA cannot do anything about it except say, interesting. Rainbow Farm in Orland, Maine had 5 people at 6 different sites is where they were tracked to. So the main farm and then farmers markets. But again, no idea if there was any compliance. I would suspect probably not, right? While it's great that people want to produce their own eggs, that's wonderful. But at the same time, there are mechanisms in place to ensure that we have this safe food supply. So if we try to sum up everything up to this point, you can see that as we move from the conventional cage to extensive housing systems, so left to right, we start to trade off on some of our things. Welfare is really crappy in the conventional cage, and we give them lots more options to do good and bad things for welfare, but we may trade off some food safety. Or if we look at worker environment, it was okay over here, but it may not be near as good as we think it is as we get further and further away from the conventional cage. Some of this is my own opinion. Some of it, there is a little bit of science to give some indication of which way it's moving. So it really is a very complex puzzle that we're trying to navigate as we move into new housing systems and the bigger scope and picture of what it means. Okay, jack of all trades, master of none. I will gladly own that. How many of you know the rest of the phrase? Anybody? Raise your hands. Yep. Exactly. This is exactly why I will own this, because I have the luxury of playing in all of these different arenas. I would never classify myself in any one of them as being an expert, but I know enough to talk with all of them so we can see the bigger pictures and what that may mean for all of us. So, what does tomorrow's housing look like? So, there is a unit here in Indiana called Kipster, and this is a great step toward what the future housing could look like. And when you go in, the birds have the ability, so they're in a cage-free housing environment. And at a certain time, the doors open and they get to go into this giant playground area in the middle, sunning area, whatever you would like to call it. And it is wonderful. If we go back here, this is the welcome center. So any of you could go at any time and go visit this facility. So I took my students and we just stood there for a while, and you can sit and watch the birds play in this giant jungle gym and just interact. But they get to go here, and then I think it's about 30 minutes later, the doors open and they can also go outside. So from a bird perspective, I have an option to go from outside, stay in my very comfortable housing, or come indoors where I'm fully protected and interact with others. So you give those birds that full choice and opportunity to go wherever they want to be. Conversely, I will also say that I'm the one that at their opening event stood in front of all of them and said, this is not the future of egg production. Because if it is, then we have already stopped innovating for what it should be tomorrow as we know more about what birds need and what their welfare could be as we continue to move forward. This is a huge step. I think it's a great step in the right direction. So this is what I dream about at night. Bird vision. I have some collaborations going with Esteban Fernandez Urisic over in biology, Greg Fraley here, where we're trying to better understand how birds visualize their environment. And this is a paper that was published from Esteban's lab, where when you get to about 0.3 meters, that's the point at which birds start to struggle to differentiate other birds. And if you go back and look at the literature with Marion Dawkins, that's also the point at which behavior seems to take an instance or a stop from being able to mimic other behaviors or have that behavior interaction is about 0.3 meters. So from our standpoint, that's pretty exciting that the behavior in the vision is lining up, as that 0.3 meters may be the distance at which birds can observe others. So with Esteban, what we're doing is the ability to model what birds may or may not be able to see. So if it's above this visual threshold, they can see it. So what this means is that if I have chicken feed as the object against a galvanized ramp, so think about birds. So they can see the chicken feed over here, but they also see the galvanized ramp over here. If it's an incandescent light, they could see that it's chicken feed, but if it's an LED lamp, they probably can't see the chicken feed and differentiate it from the galvanized ramp. So this is just some preliminary data as we continue to work on these research projects that we have. As a result, I've pulled together this team from around the university here. So we've got USDA, ARS, animal science, biology, natural resources, and then animal science. And the idea is, can we do similar to what they do in ecology and create agent-based modeling for chickens? And so the idea is we are currently over here developing the agent-based model. We ran two types of housing systems, the extremes of cage-free, collected the data. Now we're trying to see, can we get to a point where a computer could actually model the type of housing system we should produce? And then going into the next year and a half here, we want to actually build whatever the computer says would work and run some chickens and see if they perform like the model predicts. At the same time, working with Polytechnic and mechanical engineering, we're trying to better understand keel bone fractures and some of the things that go on with the skeleton of the bird. So we're placing sensors, and we're just about a year into our grant, placing sensors on the keel, with the idea then that we can collect the data to create digital twins and then simulate various things in a virtual environment to better understand how they're occurring and do this as an iterative process so that we can get to a point where we could actually develop a digital twin of the keel bone for chickens and be able to simulate what may happen in different housing environments to that particular bone from the skeletal perspective. So what's the future? And I have no idea. Does anybody know? Is this how you cite ChatGPT when you ask it to give you a fortune cookie with or a crystal ball with the chicken? So this is from ChatGPT. I don't know what the future is. I'm not sure that a lot of us do, but I do think that there's so many exciting things that we can play on right now that if we can start to come up with innovative ways to ask our questions, we can really start to move that proverbial egg down the nest to whatever the future might be for our respective housing systems that factor in the welfare, the food safety, the bird themselves, and then ultimately what the consumer wants. With the goal being that by the time you go into the marketplace and you have all of these choices, you better understand exactly what it is that you're selecting so that we can eliminate some of the confusion of what it means to be pasture raised, so that when you talk pasture raised to a consumer, they understand that this is what you're talking about. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes. Yep. So when the question was for those that can't hear it, are there information out there on the nutritional quality of eggs for humans? So that is the hardest thing to crack. Sorry, pardon, I can't resist. The reason being is that in order to have a label claim, you have to be able to provide the scientific evidence that it in fact has an outcome. So Eggland's Best is the only egg that has been successful that if they say there's 125 milligrams of omega-3, it's because it has been directly linked to human health, that if you have 125 milligrams, this is the result that is positive, right? So it's very hard when you start to look at nutritional claims on eggs to be able to do some of the things like vitamin D enhanced or things like that. So yeah, there's various research out there. It just comes back to being able to prove it from a human health perspective. They're all pre-cooking. Yes, exactly. Yep. Yeah, and to Greg's point, that is true. Those claims are prior to cooking, right? That's a whole nother thing once we degrade that whatever the nutrient is during the cooking process. Yeah, so this is where, so when we look at the eggs coming into the market, every egg that we buy as a consumer in the shell product is going to have the ability that it is a perfect egg, so to say, right? The way the equipment is designed in the processing standpoint, any cracks, any internal defects that may occur, um, anything that would keep the egg from getting to you as a consumer in the carton will be removed. Those eggs then are sent to breaking plants and they go to liquid egg product or other egg, dry egg products, right? Where the challenge becomes is that Salmonella enteritidis is a bacterium that is passed horizontally. So that means it's passed from the mother to the offspring through the egg. And there is no screening tool. So we know that when we clean our eggs and then we refrigerate them, we reduce the chances of the bacterium cell multiplying because of the temperature. And then if you properly cook your eggs, you should be perfectly fine. If you, as an egg producer, have a positive environment, so the producers are required to swab their environments. If it comes up positive for Salmonella enteritidis, they then have the option to either euthanize the flock or divert the eggs for testing. So what that means is that every egg produced from that flock has to go to a breaking plant and be pasteurized as liquid egg product. At the same time, they are pulling 100 egg samples, and they have to have, I can't remember the exact number. I think it's 1,500 egg samples that have been sampled then and tested for Salmonella enteritidis. If they're all clean, then they can go back to selling the eggs in the marketplace as shell eggs. So there are ways that producers can navigate so that what we have entering our food supply is ideally safe and sound from a food safety perspective. Yep. So there are no growth hormones nor antibiotics given to poultry in general, especially for laying hens, because when they are given, especially with antibiotics, it goes directly into the egg. So they couldn't sell those. Growth hormone, there's just no way to give it. Even if we wanted to, there's no way to give it to them as an exogenous source that would actually have something productive. And nobody wants to go through and handle 2.5 million birds to give them a injection of growth hormone. So yeah, even in the water. So yep. Yeah.
My question might be maybe some.
Nope.
About no antibiotics, no.
Mhm.
That's really what you was saying.
Yep. So what's interesting in the organic program is that you can take any bird, and from its first day of from its first consumption of food, it has to be an organic diet, and it has to be on organic land. Those are the two requirements for poultry to be able to produce it as organic. So it's certified organic. So there's a process in which for a 3-year period to make it. So you can take land that you have been doing herbicides or fertilizers, and then you can go through a 3-year transition to where you no longer use any of those, and the chickens can be on that land. That's certified organic. So as long as they're on that land and fed an organic diet, then their eggs are organic. If you have to treat your birds and it's outside of what organic program allows, then all those birds have to come off the organic program and they can't re-enter the program. Yeah.
So
Yep.
that it's actually about
Uh-huh.
chicken actually opens the. So why you do it? Why not just let the be it?
So, well, true. So the question was about salmonella and outside of the egg versus inside. So enteritidis is specific inside, right? But we do know that there's other salmonellas that are present in the environment. So when those eggs go through the washing process, the temperature of the wash water actually has to be 10 degrees hotter than the temperature of the egg, so that when the egg goes through the hot water through thermodynamics, the pores open out and actually push things out instead of pull things in. So from a science standpoint, right? We have tried to put things in place that would reduce the likelihood of anything like that happening. But to your point, in other parts of the world, they don't wash their eggs at all, right? You can buy your eggs in Europe, and when you open the carton, if there's a big piece of manure on it, there's a big piece of manure on it, and you just go about your day. But that's how we have evolved our food system here in the US.
A way to have.
So the reality is that with most of our foodborne pathogens, if we cook our food to the proper temperature, we can inactivate any of them for the most part, right? Our problem is that you get the people that want to have raw eggs, right? And so they make their raw egg protein shakes or whatever it is that they want to do. They don't want to, they want a over easy egg where they don't cook it to the proper temperature to actually kill anything in the yolk. So those different food techniques actually then can result in some of the illness occurring. So actually what's interesting in Europe, if they have a flock that comes up positive for Salmonella enteritidis, they euthanize the entire flock that day. They don't even, they don't do anything to try to keep the birds around. They also, at least from when I've talked to producers in other countries, they are not having some of the problems that we have had in the past with Salmonella outbreak. And the thought process behind some of that is they're also smaller flocks. So the scale, so there's a lot of things that we, because in the US, our mindset has always been we can do it bigger and better. And so that has trickled over into how we produce our eggs as well. And so they do have instances pop up here and there, but I would say that their incidence of Salmonella enteritidis in their eggs are no worse or better than what we have actually had here in the US as well. Oh, it's fine.
So,
Mhm. Yeah, so the question was what started the trend of people wanting to produce their own food? I don't know what it is. I can tell you that from my experiences growing up, so my parents own a mail order hatchery and their clientele are the small backyard people, that trend has been increasing since probably late 90s, mid 90s, somewhere in there. It's just, I think there's a lot of distrust in the way that we produce our food. There's also some thought process that I can produce it more efficiently or better than how you do it. And I also know what I'm putting into my birds that are producing my eggs. So there's a level of comfort that I know what I'm doing. I don't know that that's always the case, but I think that's some of the mentality behind it. Other questions? Oh, no. Yep. Yeah. So if you look on the cartons, you will see that they will carry the American Humane Certified seal. And so it's no so there's that one, there's United Egg Producers, even USDA, right? USDA is a voluntary program for eggs. So if you look, you will see eggs that do not have the USDA seal on it. Those are companies that choose to not have USDA come in voluntarily and verify what the carton says or the eggs that are in that carton. Um, so if you just read your cartons, they'll have the different seals for what programs they're following. No, it's fine. Yep. Yep. So the question was if you look at like a Kroger brand or any store brand egg, what is their specifications? And that is a great question, right? Some will be forthcoming and you can dig and find it within their website that this is our standard for how we have it against. Others, that is not the case, right? So, for instance, if you look at Walmart, okay, I don't know that you can find Walmart standards, but Walmart standards are a unique set of standards, and all Walmart product is voluntarily graded by USDA. So, when USDA goes in to evaluate a Walmart product, when it's being produced, they have to use the Walmart specifications, which are more stringent than the USDA specifications. So that's how USDA can actually help to verify some of the other programs, is that they're there to make sure that depending on what the certification is, they're the certifying body that can verify, yes, you are meeting whatever that stringent standard is. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you very much.